The old freezer had been sitting behind Calloway's salvage for 11 years, and nobody had ever given it a second look. But Poppy Sinclair wasn't looking at the freezer that Tuesday morning. She was looking at the car. It was a dark green Buick, mid-90s, crushed along the passenger side, like something had hit it hard and kept going. Poppy walked past it every morning on her way through the yard. Her grandmother Bet ran the small office at the back of the salvage lot, had run it since Poppy's grandfather died 3 years ago. And every morning Poppy noticed things the adults didn't. The way the frost settled differently on certain hoods, the way birds avoided specific corners of the yard, the way that particular Buick had begun in the last 2 days to make a sound that wasn't the wind. She was 11 years old. She knew the difference. It was early March, and the ground in Sudbury, Ontario was still locked in that stubborn late winter state, not quite frozen, not quite mud, just gray and ungoving. Poppy wore her grandfather's old work jacket, olive green, 3 sizes too big, sleeves rolled 4 times, and her boots were the rubber kind that didn't do much against the cold but were the only ones she had that fit. She walked slowly toward the Buick. The sound was low, rhythmic, not mechanical, not the settling of metal. She pressed her palm against the trunk. Hello? Silence. Then a single, dull knock from inside. Poppy's heart climbed into her throat. She looked back at the office. The light was on, which meant Bet was already at her desk with her tea, probably sorting invoices, probably not going to hear anything over the radio she kept on at low volume all morning. Poppy looked at the trunk. She looked at the latch. Her hands were shaking when she found the release. The trunk opened, and the smell came first. Cold sweat, metal, something medicinal. Then the man. He was large, or had been large once. Now he seemed somehow collapsed into himself, knees drawn up, wrists bound behind his back with zip ties, a strip of silver tape across his mouth. His suit, a dark charcoal suit, the kind Poppy had only seen in the windows of stores she didn't go into, was torn at the shoulder and stained brown along the lapel. His eyes found hers. They were blue and very aware, and they were the most frightened eyes Poppy had ever seen on an adult face. She reached for the tape, hesitated. "I'm going to pull it off," she said, like she was warning him, like she was a nurse or something. "Okay? I'm going to pull it off." He nodded once. She pulled. He made a sound she'd remember for the rest of her life. Not a scream, more like a breath that had been held for hours, finally being let go. He coughed. He pressed his face toward the cold air. He said very quietly, "Thank you. Who did this to you? I need—" He stopped. Coughed again. "I need you to call the police, and please don't tell anyone else. Not yet. Can you do that?" Poppy Sinclair was 11 years old, and she had seen enough of the world to know that when a grown man said please to a child, he meant it. "Stay here," she said, which was a ridiculous thing to say to a man who couldn't move, and they both knew it, and something in his eyes shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. She ran. His name was Douglas Hart, and he was not the kind of man who ended up in the trunk of a car. At least, that was what everyone who knew him would have said in the days that followed. Douglas Hart, 61 years old, founder and chairman of Hart Meridian Group, one of the largest private infrastructure firms in Northern Ontario. A man who had built his career and his considerable reputation on being unflappable, on seeing problems before they arrived and solving them quietly and early. He had handled union disputes, equipment failures, a corruption investigation in 2019 that had quietly exonerated him and destroyed 3 careers around him. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms and the temperature of those rooms changed. He had been in that trunk for 19 hours. The police came. Then the paramedics. Then at some point in the controlled chaos that followed, a black SUV arrived, and 2 men in wool coats got out and showed badges and asked everyone to step back, and the controlled chaos became just chaos. Poppy stood near the office door and watched. Bet stood beside her with her hand on Poppy's shoulder. She'd arrived at a run when Poppy came to get her, had taken one look at the situation and called 911 before Poppy could finish explaining, and now neither of them spoke. They just watched. At one point, a paramedic walked past, and Poppy heard the words mild hypothermia and dehydration and wrists are going to need looking at. At another point, she saw Douglas Hart being helped to a sitting position on the back of an ambulance, a silver blanket around his shoulders, and she saw him look across the yard until he found her. He held her gaze for a long moment. She wasn't sure what the expression on his face meant. She was only 11. She hadn't yet learned all the ways adults looked at people they owed something to. The police wanted her statement. A woman officer, kind and patient, asked her the same questions 3 times in slightly different ways, and each time Poppy gave the same answers. She'd heard a sound, she'd checked, she'd found him, she'd gotten her grandmother. That was all. "You're a brave girl," the officer said. Poppy didn't feel brave. She felt tired and cold and like she wanted a cup of Betty's tea and maybe to not think about the look in that man's eyes for a while. Bet Sinclair had run the salvage office for 40 years, first alongside her husband Roy, then alone. She was 73, had arthritis in both hands, and a bad hip she refused to do anything about. And she moved through the world with the particular efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that most things were more complicated than they appeared. She'd seen a lot of things come through the yard. Cars that had been in accidents, cars that had been abandoned. Once memorably, a car that had contained a very large amount of cash and no documentation, which she had turned over to the OPP without comment and never spoken of again. She had not seen this before. After the official vehicles left and the yard went quiet, Bet made Poppy eat something. Toast, because it was what they had, with honey from the jar they kept on the windowsill, and they sat at the small kitchen table at the back of the office and didn't talk for a while. The radio was still playing. Something country, low and soft. "You okay, sweetheart?" Bet finally asked. "Yeah," Poppy said. "Is he going to be okay?" The paramedic said he'll be fine. Cold and sore, but fine. Poppy nodded. She pulled her grandfather's jacket tighter. Outside, the gray March sky was lightening at the edges, not warmth exactly, but the promise of it. "Grandma," she said. His hands were really cold. When I helped him out, his hands were really cold." Bet looked at her granddaughter. Poppy was staring at the table, at the grain of the old wood, at nothing in particular. Bet reached across and covered Poppy's hand with her own swollen, rough one. "You did good," she said. "You did exactly right." Douglas Hartett did not go home for 2 days. The hospital wanted to monitor him. The police had questions. His lawyers, 3 of them, arriving in stages like they'd been queued, had more questions. His assistant, a meticulous woman named Patricia who had worked for him for 16 years, sat in the hospital corridor with a tablet and made phone calls and spoke in the low, urgent tones of someone managing a significant situation with as little visible alarm as possible. His daughter, Lydia, flew in from Vancouver. She was 32, dark-haired, and had her father's eyes without his composure. She arrived at the hospital looking like she'd slept on the plane, which she had, and went straight to his room, and Douglas Hart, who had not cried in front of anyone since his wife's funeral 12 years ago, allowed himself in that moment to not be a chairman of anything. He told the police what he knew, which was not as much as they'd hoped. He'd been leaving the office late, earlier than he normally stayed, which was notable. Someone had been waiting by his car. There had been something, a cloth, and then there had been nothing, and then there had been the inside of a trunk. He hadn't seen faces. He'd heard 2 voices, maybe 3. He didn't know how long they'd driven. The investigator, a detective named Warren, nodded and wrote things down and said they were pursuing several leads, which Douglas recognized as the language of "we don't know much yet." What he kept coming back to in the hours of lying in a hospital bed with monitors beeping quietly beside him was the girl. He'd asked Patricia out about her. Not intrusively, just her name, that she was all right. That the salvage yard was, it turned out, a legitimate small business that had been operating since the 70s. The girl's name was Poppy Sinclair. She lived with her grandmother. Her parents were not in the picture. Douglas didn't ask more than that. He was not a sentimental man. He'd made his peace with that description long ago. But he remembered those 11-year-old eyes looking at him through the trunk like he was a problem she intended to solve, and something about that kept returning to him in the quiet, beeping hospital room. He sent a letter first. Not an email, a letter on Heart Meridian letterhead, handwritten, which surprised even Patricia. He thanked Bet Sinclair for the use of her property and for her and her granddaughter's quick action. He included a check for $2,000. He said it was to cover any disruption to their business, which was not entirely true. There had been some disruption, a few days of police tape, some press. But the money was not really about the disruption, and they all knew it. Bet deposited the check and wrote back. A card, actually. A card from the drugstore with a scene of birch trees on the front. because that was the kind of card they had at the Sudbury drugstore in March, and inside she wrote, in handwriting that shook slightly from the arthritis, "Thank you for your kindness. Poppy has been well. She is back at school and doing fine. We are glad you have recovered." She signed it Bet Sinclair and Poppy. Douglas read that card 3 times. He put it in his desk drawer. 6 weeks later, he went to the yard. He told himself he was going because he was back in Sudbury for a site visit. Heart Meridian had several active projects in the region, and it was simply practical to stop by in person to express his thanks. He told Lydia the same thing when she raised an eyebrow at his itinerary. He half believed it. He drove himself, which he rarely did. He didn't want Patricia or a driver. He parked on the gravel outside Callaway's Salvage, still bearing the old name. The Sinclairs had never changed the sign, and got out and stood for a moment in the April light, which was a different thing entirely from March light. The ice was gone from the ground. The trees at the edge of the property had the faint yellow-green haze of early buds. The office door opened, and a small girl in an oversized jacket looked out at him. She wasn't wearing the jacket as protection anymore, he noted. The weather had warmed enough that she wore it the way kids wore things that had meaning rather than function. Collar up, sleeves unrolled this time, like a kind of flag. "You're the man from the trunk," she said. "I am," he said. "You're Poppy." "Yeah." She came down the 2 wooden steps to the gravel. "You look better." "I feel better." He paused, considerably. She looked at him with the frank evaluative stare of an 11-year-old who has decided to form her own opinion. "Your hands were really cold," she said. "I kept thinking about that." "I know," he said. "Mine too." He stayed for an hour that first time. Bet made tea. They sat in the small office, Poppy on the floor, with a book she wasn't really reading, Douglas in the spare chair, Bet at her desk, and talked about the salvage business, about the area, about the mild winter everyone was relieved to see ending. Douglas was careful not to talk about himself so much, which was a deliberate choice. He was aware that wealth had a way of filling rooms in ways that made some people uncomfortable, and the last thing he wanted was for these two, the woman who'd let his rescuer live on her property, the child who'd pulled him out of the dark, to feel anything but at ease. At one point, Poppy asked him, without looking up from her book, what Heart Meridian built. "Bridges, mostly," he said. "Roads, some water infrastructure, the things that make other things possible." She looked up then. "Like what?" "Like a bridge makes it possible for people on one side of a river to reach people on the other side." "We have a bridge," she said, "on Highway 17. It's been under construction since I was 8. That," Douglas said, "sounds about right." Bet made a sound that might have been a laugh. He came back 2 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that. It wasn't something he'd planned, not exactly. He had genuine reasons to be in Sudbury regularly. The site visits were real, but the visits to the yard were not about infrastructure. He was honest enough with himself to know that. The thing was, he hadn't known he was lonely. He'd been busy for so long that the busyness had stood in for something, and it had stood in so successfully that he hadn't noticed what was missing until he was sitting in a small salvage office in Sudbury, drinking mediocre tea and listening to a child explain in meticulous detail why the second Harry Potter book was better than the first one. He'd never had more children after Lydia. He and his wife Catherine had talked about it, had tried for a few years, and then Catherine had gotten sick, and then that had become the whole of their world, until it wasn't anymore. And by the time Douglas had surfaced from grief, he was 50 years old, and the question had resolved itself. He had Lydia. Lydia was extraordinary. He had not thought very much about what else there might have been. He thought about it now, sometimes, sitting in that office, watching Poppy do her homework at the corner of her grandmother's desk, or watching her navigate the yard, with the absolute physical confidence of a kid who'd grown up in a particular place and knew every inch of it. She moved through the rows of wrecked cars like she'd memorized them. She knew which hoods were safe to step on and which would give under pressure. She knew where the yard cat, a large, opinionated tabby named Bruce, liked to sleep in the afternoon. He'd asked her once, early on, where her parents were. He'd asked it carefully the way you ask careful questions, and Poppy had answered without any particular distress. "My dad's not around. My mom is in Timmins. She's got some stuff she's working through." The last part was clearly someone else's phrasing, something an adult had given her, and she'd taken it and made it her own. Bet looks after me. I see, he'd said. She's good at it, Poppy said. She's the best person I know. It was Bet who finally said something on a Saturday in June when Douglas had driven up on a day that had nothing to do with site visits. Poppy was outside somewhere in the yard. Bet poured tea and sat down across from Douglas and folded her arthritic hands on the desk and looked at him with the direct gaze of a woman who had been patient long enough. I want to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer me straight. I'll try, he said. What is it you're looking for, coming here? Douglas was quiet for a moment. Outside they could hear Poppy talking to Bruce, or at Bruce, which was more accurate, in the low, one-sided conversation she had with the cat most afternoons. I'm not sure I know how to answer that, he said finally. I think you do, Bet said. Not unkindly, just firmly. He turned his tea mug in his hands. When I was in that trunk, he said slowly, I had a lot of time to think, and most of what I thought about was not the company, not the projects. I thought about Catherine, I thought about Lydia. I thought about whether I'd gotten the balance right. He paused. And then this child opened the trunk and looked at me like I was a problem that needed solving, and I thought, whatever else I got wrong, maybe I still have time to do something right. Bet watched him. I don't want anything from you, he said, or from Poppy. This isn't about the rescue. It's not gratitude exactly. He stopped. She's a good kid. She's the best kid, Bet said. There was something in her voice, careful, weighted. Are you all right, he asked. You and Poppy, are you managing? Bet looked at her hands. We manage, she said. We always have. But she paused. My hip is worse than I let on. And the yard, the business is fine. It's fine. But I'm 73 and Poppy's 11, and I think about what happens when I can't. She stopped. Looked up. I just think about it is all. Any grandmother would. The room was very quiet. She doesn't know, Bet said. I don't want her worried. No, Douglas said. Of course not. He called Lydia that evening from his hotel. He told her about Bet, the hip, the age, the worry he'd seen in her eyes when she talked about the future. He told her about Poppy. He told all of it in the particular careful way he'd learned to tell Lydia difficult things, not burying the point, but not charging at it either. When he finished, Lydia was quiet for a moment. Dad, she said, I know, you've been going back every 2 weeks. Yes, and this is a child who has no father in the picture and whose mother is working through some things, Douglas said. Yes. Another pause. Are you going to ask me if this is a good idea? I don't know yet what the idea is, he said honestly. I think, Lydia said slowly, that you should probably just say what you're thinking. Out loud, to her grandmother, and maybe to her. She's 11, Dad. She found a man bound and gagged in a car trunk and didn't fall apart. She can handle a conversation, he laughed. It surprised him. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected. Okay, he said. He brought it up on a Thursday, when Poppy was at school and Bet was alone in the office. He'd thought about it for 2 weeks. He'd talked to his lawyers about the correct way to approach certain things. A legal framework, protections, the right terminology. He'd talked to Lydia. He'd thought about it early in the morning and late at night and in the middle of site meetings that deserved more of his attention. He told Betty that he'd like to help, properly. Not with checks and gestures, but structurally. The yard, her medical bills, Poppy's schooling, whatever came next. He told her that he'd like, if she was open to it, and if Poppy was open to it, to be part of their lives in some ongoing way. A presence, someone Poppy could call, someone who showed up. He told her he understood if she said no. Bet listened to all of it, with her hands folded and her face still. When he finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. I have one question, she said finally. All right. When she's grown up, Bet said carefully, when she's out in the world, do you intend to be someone she can rely on? Not financially, just someone she knows is there. Yes, Douglas said. That's exactly what I intend. Bet nodded slowly, looked out the window at the yard, at the rows of quiet, broken things she'd spent her life making use of. Then you should probably be here when she gets home from school, she said. So you can ask her yourself. Poppy came through the door at 3:47, backpack on one shoulder, a worksheet in one hand, and the expression of someone who had survived a Thursday and was prepared to relax about it. She stopped when she saw Douglas. Oh, she said. Hey, he said. She put her backpack down, looked at her grandmother, who gave nothing away, and then back at Douglas. Are you staying for dinner? That depends. he said. "I wanted to talk to you about something, if that's all right." She sat down on the floor, which was where Poppy tended to sit when she was preparing to give something her full attention. Douglas looked at Bet. Bet made a small gesture. "Go on." He told her as simply as he could, that he'd like to help them, with the business, with school, with things they needed, that he'd like to be in their lives, that none of this had conditions and none of it was about owing each other anything. Poppy listened. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "You're not going to try to replace my grandma," she said, "right? Because nobody could." "No," Douglas said. "Absolutely not. Your grandma is irreplaceable. Or my mom, even though it's complicated." "Poppy," he said, "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'd like to be something in your life, if you'd let me." She thought about this. She pulled at a loose thread on the hem of the big jacket. Her grandfather's jacket, he'd come to understand. She looked at her grandmother. "Bet," she said, "do you like him?" "I think he's decent," Bet said carefully. "I think he means what he says." Poppy looked back at Douglas for a long, evaluating moment, the same look she'd given him that first morning in March, through the open trunk, like he was a problem she was deciding whether to take on. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. Yeah." She picked up her worksheet. "But if you're coming for dinner, you have to eat whatever Bet makes. She makes this thing with lentils, and you can't say you don't like it, because she'll know you're lying." Something happened in Douglas' Hart's chest. Something that had been wound tight for a very long time came slowly loose. "I like lentils," he said. Poppy nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good," she said. "Bruce doesn't, but Bruce is wrong about a lot of things." Later, after dinner, after the lentils, which were in fact excellent, and after Poppy had done the rest of her worksheet at the kitchen table, while Douglas and Bet drank tea and talked quietly about the summer, about the hip surgery Bet had finally agreed to schedule, about small and practical things, Douglas drove south along the highway toward his hotel. The May evening was long and soft, the sky holding its light stubbornly at the edges. The Canadian Shield stretched out on either side of the road, rocks and water and trees, the particular landscape of a place that had been exactly what it was for a very long time. He thought about Catherine. He thought about her often, less with grief now than with something that had matured past grief into a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge of what she would have said, what she would have made of things. She would have liked Bet, he thought. The two of them would have gotten on immediately, would have recognized something in each other, some quality of fundamental pragmatism. And Poppy. Catherine would have adored Poppy, would have been delighted by her, would have found the big jacket and the forthright manner, and the absolute affection for a difficult cat entirely, perfectly correct. He hadn't been able to give Catherine the children they'd hoped for. He hadn't been able to do a lot of things in the end: time, illness, the particular cruelty of how quickly things could change. But he was here, still, on a May evening in northern Ontario, driving towards something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it was still beginning. The highway curved north toward the lake, and Douglas Hart kept driving, through the last of the light, toward whatever came next.